Hello, I'm John Harris from the Bramhill History Group, and I'm here with the Reverend Jim Scott, who was born in Bramhill and has served St Martin's Church and the village for over 30 years. And he's a keen historian. So, Jim, what is the age of the actual church buildings?
Well, we have a list of vicars going back to the 1200s, and it's probably true to say the church is about that age, 13th century. Though there is some evidence in the tower that there may well have been a church on the same site before that. The whole thing, very much connected with Stanley Abbey, which is only just down out of the hill. The abbey now well gone, of course, since Henry VIII came along, but there is some evidence of the abbey still there, and Bramhill Church was very much involved with that as well. So we do have pretty well documented the fact that there was a church here back in the 1200s and possibly before that as well. The present building, though, is the 1200s, I think, with some alterations both by Mr Cromwell and also by the Victorians. The Victorians were great people for altering churches, not always in the best way.
So what, over the years, what additions have actually been made to the church?
To the church, over the years, well, the tower was actually built several centuries after the main church. The tower was there, and that's probably, there have been structural alterations inside. I mean, the rood roof was taken away, which was apparently a beautiful thing, and various other alterations inside the church. The pews themselves, right up through the nave, are unique because each pew end has different carvings on it. The carvings are beautifully done. So again, the pews are unique as well as quite a bit of the other church as well. There's a font which is reputed to go back to the date of the Stanley Abbey, the Cistercian Abbey down at Stanley. And the pew, well, some doubt about the actual age of it, but pretty old, and lots of sermons preached from that pulpit, including myself, of course. So they're the sort of structural alterations, I suppose, or structural things. But I mean, we've had a modern heating system put in. There are plans to do other things as well. One of the main things that we really do need, basically, it's probably true to say that the church itself stands very much as it did in the 13th century.
And what about the bells, Jim? There's some pretty interesting
yes, we've
bells that are frequently rung, aren't there?
We've got a tower of 6 bells. The age of the bells goes back here through the centuries. They were rehung a few years ago. We have a very, very keen and enthusiastic and committed team of ringers who ring. So every service we have the bells rung. The bells are rung for every service. Sunday services and special services as well, including quite often for funerals, always for weddings. As I say, we have a very enthusiastic team in the tower. I don't get involved because I've got no sense of rhythm and probably end up going through the tower route. But as I say, there is a date for each of the 6 bells in there. Unfortunately, I can't quite remember what those dates were.
And what about the Sanctus bell? I think that's...
Sanctus bell is actually, there is a little tower on the top of the chancel roof for the Sanctus bell, which would have been rung during communion services, well, back in the time before the Reformation, of course. So the little tower there, but the bell's gone. But that would have been rung during services. There is also, not uniquely, but interestingly, in the chancel, something called a squint window. And this is where people, I don't know, for whatever reason, who couldn't go into the church, could actually look through and actually see the service going on. And again, I'm not sure how unique that is, but it's certainly unique our churches around.
One of the other interesting parts of the church is just by the porch, and that are the stone steps that wind their way up to a small room above the porch.
Right. Again, we're talking 15th century probably for this. This was over the porch itself there is a little room, and it's said that this was actually where the priest or a curate would actually teach children. Whether or not the priest actually lived up there or what, I don't know. It's not very big, but it was used for teaching, I gather. And it's got an interesting stone on the floor, which actually has got interesting markings on that. So again, very unique is that little porch above that little room above the main porch.
You mentioned Cromwell and the rood screen. Did Cromwell and his cohorts do much damage to the fabric of St. Martin's?
I think most of it, he would have actually, there would have probably have been paintings on the wall, and that's the sort of thing his men would have got away with. But I'm not aware of a great deal of damage he actually did to the church. In fact, it's said that Dr. Townsend was actually allowed to stay in position during the time of Cromwell, which is most unusual. Most of them were actually had to go. But he stayed and in fact founded the almshouses, which you can find in Kingsbury Street in Caen. So, and this is really something which is quite unique to Bremhill, in as much as there are all sorts of quite famous people whose names have been linked to Bremhill in one way or another. A lot of this, of course, comes from one of its illustrious vicars, Canon William Bowles, who actually was a vicar here from 1805 to the 1840s. He retired to Salisbury, and I think he died in 1852, and he and his wife are actually buried in the nave of Salisbury Cathedral. And he had a great deal of connection when he was in Bremhill for his long stay here with the Lansdownes at Bowood House, and to such an extent that if anyone stayed at Bowood, and they could be men or women of a literary bent, or poets, or even politicians, used to quite often go over to Bremhill Vicarage and be entertained by Mr. and Mrs. Bowles, and of course Mr. and Mrs. Bowles were often entertained at Bowood House. So,
oh, right. I noticed moving outside that there's some very interesting poems on a lot of the gravestones in the churchyard. Was he the writer of them?
Yes, that was William Bowles as well. Bowles, before he became Vicar of Bremhill, before he became a priest in fact, was a poet, and he wrote some quite good sonnets, about 14 of them, back in the 1790s, which were published. Poets like Samuel, like Coleridge and even Wordsworth and others thought that they were excellent, and in fact Coleridge said that Bowles really was the beginning of the what was known as the Romantic movement in poetry, and so that was some good stuff. He continued to write poetry pretty well much through his life, but some of it wasn't too good. Byron was very critical of his poetry. When you think about it, that's another name, Byron, drop it into Bowles' life, which of course is a connection with Bremhill. So lots of people like that. Bremhill Vicarage was a very important centre for all sorts of things going on. They had no children, he and his wife, but they were ecumenical into the fact that they used to entertain the minister of the Moravian church down in East Titherton with his daughters, and they would have these musical evenings. So again, he was quite advanced in many ways.
No doubt in the vicarage, which is next door to the church where I believe Bowles lived. There's an interesting fact as well, I think, that you once carried out an exorcism in that vicarage.
Yes, that's very true, I did. A person in the house was bothered she said, by the figure of a man dressed in Victorian labouring clothes who used to haunt our upstairs rooms, and so there was, I called in the diocesan expert on these things, and yes, we did conduct an exorcism. I'm not saying that was the first one that ever happened in the 800 years of the church's life, but yes, that was one we did.
Okay, well, moving on to brighter things. The porch has a very beautiful window engraved by Frye from drawings by the famous artist and his friend Norman Neeson. Did Leslie live in the village?
Leslie was very much part of the village. His family were bakers for generations in the village, down at the bottom of the village, and Leslie, after the war and when his father died, continued the tradition of being the village baker, and eventually also the shop at the top of the village. So yes, Leslie was very much a Bramhill man. He got too old. He eventually went into a home, if you like to call it, a care home, where he died. But he was very, very much and very active, artistic in as much that he wasn't a painter, but he was a glass engraver, and he did some wonderful glass engraving.
I think his other famous attribute was his winemaking.
Yes, his winemaking. His winemaking was mostly from the fruits he grew in his garden, plums and damsons and things like that. And he could produce a wine that it'd be difficult to tell the difference between that and a good port or sherry. It really was some good stuff. And John and he put on some art exhibitions in the church on several occasions, and quite a lot of people came along for that, including some who, as far as I could remember at the time, had never been inside the church before. But it was good wine.
But it certainly helped the preview evenings on the art exhibitions, I seem to remember, Jim.
Did, yes.
So that's some very interesting stories you've got there of the church. How do you actually see the future of the church panning out?
Well, like all churches, it obviously suffered over the years from declining numbers in congregations. But at present, I think I can certainly say that Bramhill Church is on a very sound footing. It has a good core of regular churchgoers, and obviously these numbers are boosted at holidays and holidays like Christmas and Easter and things. So, and it's on a sound financial footing as well, thanks to the efforts of quite a few people, including the treasurer and his wife, and the whole parochial church council work to make this church, I think, have a good future. I think I see no fears for the future.
Well, that's
certainly.
good news. The Friends of St Martin's, of course, support it. Now that's quite an old and friendly society, isn't it?
Well, that goes back to the 1770s, and it was originally formed as a charity, really to help the poor of the village, and the agricultural society in which they lived. Agricultural workers weren't very well paid, and their conditions were pretty poor. So really, that's what the society was formed for. But it evolved over the years, and so in I suppose the last 40 years or so, it's become a fundraising society for the church. Obviously, the church benefits greatly from the money it's raised, but also any other charitable organisations in the village. I mean, over the years, youth clubs, senior citizens clubs, things of that nature, the village hall, have actually benefited from the money raised by the the Friends of St Martin Committee, which I'm privileged to be chairman of at the moment. So yes, that does it, and that has a very interesting history, which could probably fill up a whole tape, John, if we wanted to.
Well, some of the facts have been lost in the mist of time, but there's some quite interesting things to talk about the village cross, yes, which also features in the Friends of St Martin's Feast of Weardale,
well,
I believe.
It does. The village cross reputedly was put there in the 1760s and became very much a preaching cross for preachers and monks going through the village. It's said that the Wesleys, Charles Hall, actually preached from the village cross, and he also had a very interesting fact about it. Round about the 1840s, we were talking just now about the poor conditions of the agricultural workers, and they really were a bit of a scandal during the 19th century, and there was quite a lot of protest about it, and it was a time when people, I think, were getting onto their hind legs and deciding things that needed to be done about this. Well, there was a lady who actually lived in Goataker, the wife of a local lay preacher, who actually organised a, we wouldn't call it a riot or a march, but they gathered around this village cross in Bremhill in about 1848, I think it was, around the time, as a protest, and apparently there were about 500 people there, I presume mostly farm labourers, agricultural labourers, and it was such a, well, important thing, I suppose, that it reached the London papers. The London Daily News carried a report of it, and one Charles Dickens, who was always very concerned about the lot of the poor, he actually managed to read this article and decided he was going to do something about it. I don't think he came to Bremhill, but he wrote a poem, the poem of the Wiltshire Labourer, which, you know, you can Google at any time if you'd like copies of the words. So there again, Bremhill connection, Charles Dickens. So, you know, all through the ages, Bremhill certainly seems to have had quite a connection with the outside world, even though it is a tiny little village, and comparatively so, and but it's done very well. So,
well, thank you, Jim. That's marvellous and very interesting, and thank you for giving us some time from your busy schedule,
well, John,
to give us fascinating insights into St Martin's Church, Bremhill.
Well, if I could just say one or two lines, John. Bremhill Church, St Martin's Church, is part of a bigger group now, as in most of the Church of England. We're part of the Marden Vale group, which starts at Calne Parish Church, and so we're part of that, which includes obviously St Mary's Calne, Holy Trinity Calne, St Peter's Blackland, St Martin's Bremhill, St John's Foxham, and also Derry Hill Church. So I'm retired officially, but I'm one of the team ministers who actually minister in these churches, and I've been doing it for a long time, and it's a great privilege. Anyway, thank you, John.
Well, thank you, Jim. And also, I'd like to say a special thanks to Alan Shellard, who has helped us record this interview. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank God.